All right, we're going to go ahead and get started as we got some more people trickling in, but thank you for joining us today. My name is Jessica Greene. I'm the Director of Events and Digital Media with the Virginia Energy Efficiency Council, our VAEEC. We're excited to have 3 of our member organizations joining us today as speakers. I will get to introductions in a second, but a couple of housekeeping things. In case you are less familiar with our organization, the Virginia Energy Efficiency Council was founded in 2012. We are a 501c3 organization headquartered in Richmond, whose goal is to facilitate discussions and share resources to advance energy efficiency throughout the Commonwealth. We engage with our members to identify barriers to and opportunities for energy efficiency advancement, and to develop a strong fact-based and balanced industry voice before local, state, and national policymakers and regulators. I think everyone's probably pretty familiar with Zoom at this point in time, but if you have any questions for our speakers, or if you're encountering any technical issues, please use the chat box. We also want to get to know who's on the call. So using the chat, if you could just put your name and where you're located and what organization you're with, we would appreciate it. And we will have time at the end after all 3 speakers present to do a Q&A. Great. And in case you did not hear, we are recording today's webinar. And so you should have already received the PowerPoint slides, and we will be sending the slides out again after this, along with the recording. So just to give you some background on why we're here today to discuss the High Performance Buildings Act. This law was created in 2012. However, at the time, it only applied to state government buildings. In 2021, it was updated and expanded through HB 2001. This expanded the scope to include local governments who had populations over 100,000. In 2023, it went into effect for all jurisdictions, regardless of size. We, in talking with our members, architectural firms, local government, schools, came to the agreement that clarifications were needed. And that's why in 2024, this year's General Assembly, we and some of our members worked with the bill patron to add clarifications that would provide more specific direction. And then looking forward to 2025, this will be when the new definition of design phase goes into effect. And we will have more on that as our speakers present. So for some of the clarifications, we solicited input from our members, including our board of directors, our advocacy or advisory committees, our membership at large, and local governments across the state. We also worked with the American Institute of Architects, the Virginia chapter, the American Council of Engineering Companies, and local government associations like VAEEC and VML. So with that bit of background, I'm going to turn things over now to our speakers. First, we have Elizabeth Beardsley. Liz is Senior Policy Counsel at the U.S. Green Buildings Council. Her portfolio includes federal, state, and local green building law and policy issues. Recently, her work has focused on connecting building policy to climate mitigation, and she represents USGBC at the UNFCCC Climate Change Conference. She came to USGBC from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, where she was a senior attorney involved in evaluating government, environment, and energy programs. Liz currently serves as secretary on the VAEEC Board of Directors. Once Liz presents, we'll be hearing from both Bryna, Dunn, and Sandra Leibowitz. Bryna is vice president serving as the director of sustainability planning for Moseley Architects. She works with project teams from the early planning through building construction to ensure that the most energy efficient and environmentally responsible solutions are considered and implemented where feasible. She has over 100 LEED certified projects in her portfolio. She is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners an associate member of the American Institute of Architects, and is a LEED fellow. She served for 8 years as the chair of the U.S. Green Building Sustainable Sites Technical Advisory Group and 6 years on the LEED Steering Committee, including serving as both vice chair and chair. Bryna currently serves on the VAEEC Board of Directors. And then last but not least, as founder, owner, and managing principal of Sustainable Design Consulting, Sandra Leibowitz draws from her decades of advanced experience in sustainable design projects and organizational programs to serve owners, architects, and builders with expert green building, LEED consulting, and process management. In addition to directing firm-wide initiatives and providing quality assurance for consulting project management, Sandra now leads and operates from both of SDC's offices. So welcome to our speakers, and I will hand things off to Liz.
Great. Thank you, Jessica, and thanks everyone for joining today. Excited to talk about the updates to the High Performance Buildings Act. So building on that timeline that Jessica shared, we want to emphasize like where this started. The provisions for localities buildings was added in 2021 and really had these 4 prongs. This new provision required that localities ensure that their buildings are verified are designed, constructed, operated, and verified to high performance building certification program. 2, have sufficient zero emission vehicle charging and fueling infrastructure. Thirdly, have metering and allow measurement of energy use as well as greenhouse gas emissions from energy. And then 4th, to incorporate appropriate resilience and distributed energy features. This applied to new buildings over 5,000 square feet or renovation where the cost of the renovation exceeds half the value of the building. So this was basically the core of that locality prong of the High Performance Buildings Act. And these 4 pieces, these 4 requirements are still there, but what we sought to do this session was to make some clarifications where there was feedback and input of confusion on sort of how to interpret things and what really needed to be done, just to make it easier and more clear on what was required of local governments to comply. I do want to note here as well that there's a state buildings prong of the High Performance Buildings Act. It was not included in the 2024 bill. We're not talking about it today. So in case there's any, I don't want to be confusing about that. So that is still in law and in place. And if there's any questions on it, we could handle at the end. But we're focused today on the local building portion. Next slide, please. So the update process really started when the bill was not even passed yet. And I say that because this locality prong came from Delegate Helmer in late 2020, and he introduced the bill that added that section and made some changes to the existing law. And we saw some areas for improvement really right away. It saw where there could be some places that might not be clear on what was required or how localities would address it. So really starting there, and then we offered some amendments. A few things got in, but some did not make it into the final law that was passed in 2021. So we already had sort of these things of like, if we could, we would like to, make these fixes. And then as people looked at the act and the provisions in more detail, as practitioners try to apply them to actual projects and interpret it, this sort of list of needs came about. And, I worked with Sandra, Bryna, and the staff at VAEEC to try to take these ideas and observations, sort of get feedback throughout the community, develop draft amendment language, and work with the sponsor in sort of this really a back and forth collaborative process to arrive at language that seemed to meet the needs in terms of clarity, addressing the major elements that we'd identified, and being acceptable with the sponsor. So that was the basic process. Next, please. All right, and I'm turning it over now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Liz, and hello, everyone. I'm Sandra Leibowitz. Definition. So one of the main ways to clarify text is to define your terms. In the case of this law, there were several terms that were previously used without definition. So this update addresses that systematically in the definitions section. Starting with appropriate resilience features, which was a term previously included among locality requirements for all applicable buildings. But who defines what appropriate resilient features are, and who confirms whether proposed design solutions include sufficient resilient features? The new law defines appropriate resilience features as those included to prepare for, by reducing risk or enabling recovery, acts of nature, failures of systems, or adversarial acts that could cause a major disruption to building functionality. This empowers localities to identify potential hazards for which a project should prepare, and then empowers them to confirm the sufficiency of the proposed design solutions. So next we'll hear from Bryna.
All right, and we're just going down the list of definitions alphabetically, and the next term that lacked definition in the previous version of the law was commissioning. And so commissioning, it was and it still is mentioned in a future paragraph C, which specifically addresses buildings that are between 5,000 and 20,000 square feet. But in using the word commissioning, there really was no indication of the required scope. What does commissioning mean for buildings of this size? So, the primary point of confusion was, what is the scope for MEP and envelope commissioning? What do projects actually need to do to comply? So effective this past July 1st, so it's been in effect for a week now, the new definition, or the definition in this law of commissioning, is the process of ensuring functional performance of MEP systems. That includes water heating, lighting, automated control systems, and the building envelope. And the reference standard is the ICC G4 2018 version. This is the guideline for commissioning. And then if successor guidelines are published, or additional guidance coming from the Virginia Energy, all of those guidelines also could be applicable to buildings of this size. Then if we want to go to the next slide, design phase. You saw in the timeline at the beginning of the presentation that there was one element that actually doesn't go into effect until next July 1st, and that's the notion of what does design phase mean. The law says that, or the previous law said that the design phase is the design of a building or construction or renovation project, and it includes the issuance of a RFP, and it also includes project budget approval. And so it was a little bit vague on when a project actually had to comply with this law or not, depending on when those other steps in the timeline to getting a project launched occurred. So effective next July 1st, the definition of design phase reads: the design of a building construction or renovation project based on the effective execution date of the contract with the design team. And so that kind of draws, it seems, a little bit clearer line in the sand that when you have the contract to start schematic design, that is the beginning of your design phase, and all of those projects will have to then comply. I think there's just this little gray area in between where some projects will be exempted and some projects won't. And moving into next year, the law will more clearly capture all of the projects that are starting in 2025 and moving forward. And then if you want to go to the next slide, I'll turn it back to you, Sandra.
Great. So the prior law required buildings over 20,000 square feet to achieve third-party certification under one of three high-performance building certification programs. LEED, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, developed and certified by the U.S. Green Building Council, or Green Globes, developed and certified by the Green Building Initiative, or VEES, VEES, Virginia Energy Conservation and Environmental Standards, which is Virginia state government's adaptation of the International Green Construction Code. Since the first two are true third-party certification programs, the confusion mostly resided with the third option. There isn't a third-party verifier available to certify building compliance with VEES for local governments. Furthermore, this term VEES and the standard itself are largely unknown outside of Virginia state government for which it was intended in the first place. The new law maintains the LEED and Green Globes options, strikes the VEES option, and adds a new option for buildings 50,000 square feet and smaller, Earthcraft Light Commercial. This standard, originally developed by the South Face Institute in Atlanta, Georgia, is currently adapted, maintained, and certified by Veridient here in Richmond, Virginia. Veridient is also a Virginia Energy Efficiency Council member. One thing to note is that to satisfy the requirement of the new law using Earthcraft Light Commercial, certification must be achieved at the silver level, that program's second tier, compared with LEED certified level or Green Globe's one globe level, those programs' first tier, as an equivalency. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So the simple term locality actually also needed definition, primarily because the prior law left room for confusion as to whether it applied to public K through 12 schools, given that school districts tend to function semi-autonomously. The new law defines a locality as a county, city, or town inclusive of a school division. This not only clarifies this point of confusion, but explicitly addresses some of the most important building projects that a locality may develop and maintain, their K through 12 schools. So leaving them out of a green building program would have been most unfortunate. The new law settles that question. Next slide, please. So you heard me previously reference major disruption within the definition for appropriate resilience features. So what qualifies as a major disruption? And what are those resilience features supposed to address? The new law defines a major disruption as a disturbance that interrupts the normal activities that are conducted in a building for a duration of time that would require the building to temporarily or permanently cease operations. With this definition, localities are now empowered to define the parameters that would constitute a major disruption based on the nature and duration of a disrupting event, as well as on building typology. Depending on the locality, this may well be work they've already begun to undertake as part of climate adaptation or other risk assessment programs. So now I'll turn it back over to Bryna again.
All right, great. So the next definition has to do with sufficient ZEV charging and fueling infrastructure. And in the previous version of this law, there was a pretty wide open definition, and it took an entire slide to put it on there. But basically, they were looking for charging and fueling infrastructure that would provide charging infrastructure that was sufficient to support every passenger type vehicle owned by the locality and available for use by the locality that would be located at the building when it was fully occupied including meeting projected demand for the first 10 years following the building occupancy. It wasn't clear exactly how to do those calculations or those predictions, but that was one compliance path. Another compliance path was to just achieve the ZEV or EV charging credit in one of the high performance building certification programs that were listed in the law. If we want to jump to the next slide, I've summarized there 8 different compliance pathways that the previous language would allow. And it wasn't clear whether or not all of those compliance pathways would actually result in equivalent outcomes. It also occurs to me that there's a 9th compliance pathway if a local government tried to reference the V's guidance, that would point you then to the CPSM, and there's yet another table for EV charging. So there's 8 or 9 compliance pathways in the old law. The new law says that you just need to supply EV equipment, EV ready charging capacity and pre-wiring that's deemed sufficient based on guidance from either the Virginia Department of Energy or the US Department of Energy. The US Department of Energy, I would point people towards this PNNL technical brief. It features the Department of Energy recommendations for energy codes, and it's essentially 5% of your spaces need to have electric vehicle service infrastructure installed. You could make 10% of your spaces EV ready and 10% of your spaces EV capable. So that's one document, and also it probably would make sense to coordinate with the Virginia Department of Energy to get guidance that's appropriate to localities in Virginia for our building types and so forth to move forward on this particular provision. So if we want to move into the next section of this presentation, we've covered all of the new definitions that came out with this update. And now we're going to give you a little bit of information about the changes to technical requirements within the statute. So the first change also has to do with the EV charging and fueling infrastructure. And really within the requirements section, what they did is they took out the clause about local governments needing to consider the interest of the Commonwealth in making a sufficiency determination in terms of, how many EV charging stations you would need at a local government facility. It was also unclear what that meant, what considering the interest of the Commonwealth technically meant in terms of the number of EV charging stations a local government would need to add. And so it seems a little bit clearer with that particular item stricken.
Okay, so now we have the subject of measuring associated carbon emissions as far as technical requirements. So the prior law required localities to ensure that their buildings have features that permit the agency or institution to measure the building's energy consumption and associated carbon emissions, including metering of all electricity, gas, water, and other utilities. So again, how specifically shall associated carbon emissions be measured or calculated? The new law strikes the whole term and associated carbon emissions from the requirements. Mind you, localities may develop their own protocols for translating energy consumption into carbon emissions. For example, for their own climate action plans and their own greenhouse gas inventories, which some of them have already begun developing. But to be clear, the new law does not require them to do so. So next slide. Renewable energy requirements. The prior law required localities to ensure that their buildings incorporate, as we said before, appropriate resilience and distributed energy features. So we already addressed appropriate resilience measures earlier in the definition section. The remainder of this provision then begs the question, what specifically shall qualify as distributed energy features? Does on-site renewable energy or energy storage qualify? What if distributed energy features might not be appropriate to or feasible for the building or its site? So the new law strikes the distributed energy features text, but adds on-site renewable energy generation and energy storage, and adds as determined by the locality and following consideration of any guidance pursuant to subsection E of the law. So the new law now states on-site renewable energy and energy storage explicitly to help satisfy the requirement, which can actually be useful to localities if they need something in the law to point to in order to justify an associated capital expenditure. Also, localities with the newly included definition and Virginia Department of Energy technical assistance, which Liz will address later, are now empowered to determine the appropriateness of any or all of these strategies for themselves. And back to Bryna.
All right, so that wraps up the bulk of the law in terms of the definitions, which are extensive, and then the requirements. But there are 4 additional clauses that we wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of. And there have been some changes to 3 of those 4 additional clauses. So we're going to go through next some considerations for buildings that are a little bit smaller, less than 20,000 square feet. I'm going to talk about the provision of technical assistance, which originally was not provided, and then also equivalence to compliance for this law through local government ordinances. So let's jump, yeah, there we go to the next slide. This one has to do with small buildings and the paragraph that allowed this kind of off-ramp for buildings that were less than 20,000 square feet that didn't necessarily have to do LEED or green globes or now Earthcraft commercial. But we wanted to make sure that there was some sort of, or the law makes sure that there's some sort of provision for these smaller buildings to still do something green. And so the requirement was to make them Energy Star certified or certifiable, and also undertake commissioning. And we already talked about the new definition of commissioning. So sometimes what practitioners were finding, smaller public buildings don't have an Energy Star category for which they can certify. And so there was a point of confusion about what do those projects do. If you're interested in seeing what types of buildings are eligible to earn the Energy Star, we've included a link in the slide deck, which hopefully you all have already gotten, but you'll certainly be able to get from VAEEC. And then there's also this tool called Target Finder, which I expect many, if not all of you, are familiar with as well. And there's a much more extensive list of property types that can find a target. So you can set your target to 75 as though you were going to try to earn the Energy Star and get information about what your goals should be for that particular project type. And so we do find that some of the typically smaller public buildings do have targets in Target Finder, even if they're not eligible for a full Energy Star certification. So if you want to go to the next slide, really what you have to do now in this new paragraph is make sure that you can demonstrate, via energy modeling that your building is anticipated to perform at least as well as your Energy Star target of 75 value for that building would be, or pending additional guidance from Virginia Energy, there may be additional compliance paths that follow in that same vein. So you'll want to, check out that Energy Star Target Finder website and stay tuned for guidance from Virginia Energy.
Thanks, Bryna. And just one other thing on that for those smaller buildings, that is optional. So the Energy Star or non-Energy Star option is just if a locality decides they do not want to do the normal process with the 4 prongs and the green building system. So there's just flexibility there. So another thing that was really important that we heard was that in the original act in 2021, there was no state agency with any responsibility for the locality section. And we tried various ways, but really none of the state agencies felt able to help interpret or provide any kind of guidance, without having that spelled out. So this was a real priority for us in approaching these amendments. And we were successful. I do want to read actually the language here, because well, you'll see why. So it says now, excuse me, the Department of Energy shall, upon request, provide technical assistance related to subsections A, B, and C to localities subject to available budgetary resources. Such technical assistance may also include the issuance of guidance. So what that means is that these technical assistance is specifically given to localities, and it's upon request. So that would suggest that the localities should feel free to ask Virginia Energy for assistance. Those subsections mentioned are the ones we just went over. So the definitions, the core requirements, and then the alternative requirements are all covered there. And Mason Trimble, the program manager, is the point of contact for this law. So this is his contact information. And he did authorize VAEEC to share it. So that's in the deck that's already been sent to you. And we certainly encourage localities to request assistance. And in particular, as I went over earlier about the EV charging, is one area where Virginia Energy could issue guidance on what would be adequate charging infrastructure. And that might be something that localities want to request. And another final provision has to do with local programs. So before this, the 2021 bill passed, already a number of jurisdictions had their own rebuilding program. So there is an exception allowed for those to continue. Again, as with some of the other sections, the language was a little bit confusing. So it's been tweaked here. The key elements are that local programs need to be adopted by ordinance. The program must include standards that address those 4 primary requirements and be equal or more stringent than the requirements, and that the program must be in effect. So it can't be something that's passed and put on the shelf. So the main changes here are that with the amendments we made in 2024, the local program can exceed the stringency of the statute. It's not limited to only being equivalent. So a locality can choose that they want to do more or go farther in terms of deeper green projects. And in addition, programs can evolve and change without requiring a new ordinance every time. So that depends on the local ordinance. But if you can basically, my advice would be that a locality could have an ordinance that establishes the program, but allow updates and, some evolution over time. So that allows, as the green building programs have new versions, the locality might decide it wants to require certain credits, for example, like a directed use, or have its own emphasis within the program, like that could change without requiring that just the timing and legal input that's involved with the formality of the ordinance. So that was also changed, whereas before the program had to be adopted by ordinance and presumably amended by ordinance as well. So, and some of our members and those on the call also are examples of such programs. Alexandria and Arlington County, Fairfax County, and others have these programs. Thank you, and excuse my voice today. All right, so next step. So practitioners, read the statute. It's not that long. Hopefully it's more clear than the first version. You might want to take a look at any projects you have for localities that are either in process or coming up and try to understand the applicability of the changes. Generally, the changes, I think, are obviously we all thought they were improvements, so you might see if you can migrate to those, or you may have to stay with that what was already in place. And identify questions, but I think you'll need to send those to Virginia Energy through your local government client as noted, based on the language. So it sort of depends a bit on how formal Virginia Energy will be, but certainly localities can request assistance. Local governments, if you have your own program, look at the statutes changes and see if you need to make any modifications. If you don't have a program, you could consider creating one. And there are, as I said, several great examples locally. You can hear about the advantages that they found. Implementation is a big piece of those. And again, any questions, Virginia Energy will be the contact. So that. VAEEC also has some plans, doing a blog post on the webinar. This will be recorded and available on YouTube. And then encouraging Virginia Energy to have a more complete sharing and training community around local governments and practitioners in this act. So I think all those things will be really helpful. Back to Jessica.
All right, thank you, Sandra, Bryna, and Liz. This is now kicking off our Q&A portion. So again, if you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to use the chat box. Let's see, we just got one in. And alternatively, if you prefer, you may take yourself off mute whenever there is a lag in conversation. And I do wanna, we'll start with Jeff Sauber with Roanoke City Schools. He has a multi-part question, so I will give our speakers a second to read through it in the chat, and then feel free to answer the pieces that you feel most able to answer.
Thanks, Jesse. I'll give everybody a moment. Definitely look that over. Definitely been working on this for a number of years. With, you know, we've been doing some new schools and how that applies to us. This new schools are being constructed. So, you know, those are some questions that I have, and really, I guess, as we give them a chance to look at them over a little bit, you know, the enforcement piece of it. I retired as the building official for the city of Roanoke, so I'm just trying to figure out who's going to be the enforcement piece. You know, when I retired, I mean, we didn't have the training to do this inspections and so forth. I mean, to review the drawings and things like that. So that's kind of where I want to start with. And thank you for having us put this on, by the way, too, in presenters.
I would suggest that Liz tackle the subject of enforcement, because that's something, you know, that kind of has legal implications, and we've been wrestling with that ourselves. But as technical practitioners, that's not as much our department.
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to understand the question, Jeff, so thanks for raising that. I think it's something that came up I think both in the 2021 as well as in this year's amendments. It was pretty apparent that folks didn't want Virginia Energy to have an enforcement role, so more of an assistance role. We did have at one point language about, for example, an annual survey that just, our intent was not so much enforcement, but just checking in and seeing if it's working and what challenges people are having. But even that, I think, felt too close to oversight and enforcement like to some people, so that did not make it in. So it's really up to the locality, and you know, there are, every locality or school district, I'm sure you have your procedures for sign off on a construction project, for example, to code and to other laws. So this would be kind of amongst those laws that require review, that it's compliant. There's all kinds of procurement requirements and so on. So I think to tackle this, one thing might be to bring together relevant department chairs and sort of talk through what parts of that approval process for design and construction projects does this need to show up on a checklist? Does someone need to have primary responsibility, and who is that, and so on. So kind of talking through and making that part of your, I'm sure, existing process for approvals would make the most sense. I hope that answered your question.
Well, it's not exactly it didn't. So, I mean, the enforcement and what I'm saying, inspections and certifications that it complies with, the appropriate codes and standards. So I know from the design professional standpoint, they're going to design it because they're required by law to design it to these standards. But, the enforcement piece is what I'm getting at. You get a footing inspection, you get electrical inspection. This might fall back to special inspections in that category, or a third party might do the inspection. So, okay, well, that's a question.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess just on that point, the third party certification process does include various documentation to verify that the specific practices were in fact implemented on the project. So that is a way to make sure that the locality got what it intended to get, and that it actually earns that third party, the green building certification that you've decided to go with. If that makes sense.
Who's got
Sandra or
question?
Bryna, feel free to jump in.
Who's got
Yeah.
question number one about the 50% replacement value?
Sure, I was just rereading that one for myself. I am familiar as a consultant with the High Performance Building Act worksheet, but I have to admit I've never actually used it myself because that's not something that's in our scope to determine the cost equation. Bryna may have some additional insight into this, but it's news to me that the facilities that it references and gives examples for are pretty much all higher education. That doesn't surprise me because, again, the 2021 law, I think it's worth understanding that the 2021 law kind of took the state requirements and did, if you will, a save as, not to oversimplify it, but in a way, a save as of the state government requirements. And this looks like it was a vestigial issue that still needed to be addressed about, okay, well, if these building typologies are state government level building types, then how do we calculate the replacement or renovation costs for the types of buildings that local governments would have, the fire stations, the K through 12 schools, the city halls, et cetera. So I think our convenience standard default now would be to contact Mason with Virginia Energy and see what answer you get that way. Bryna, do you have any other thoughts about that one?
Sandra, I would have said just what you had said. I'm not familiar with any specific database for K-12 public schools or local government, specific type buildings. And I think the fact that now there is a Virginia Energy contact that can start to, look at these questions and publish, consistent guidance for all local governments to use is a big improvement over where we were prior to this update. I wish I had, more, insider knowledge of how to, calculate those costs and things, but I just don't think that knowledge exists right now. And it's something that local governments, I think, are going to have to come together and work with Virginia Energy to come up with some specific guidance on that.
I guess one other thing with the project where it was not deemed to exceed 50% replacement, but then bids were higher and they did end up triggering that. Although it's not something I would like to see as a green building advocate, there is an exemption process that you could go through locally, which requires a resolution of the governing body to give an exemption. So that could be a possibility if it's too late to make the changes to make it comply.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a great way to kick off the Q&A. Another question that came in through the chat, are there any air leakage requirements?
There are no air leakage requirements in the law, and I'm trying to think through LEED and Green Globes, and I can't think of any place where specific air leakage limits are written into those documents. I think it's really more part of the commissioning process and the project team deciding what the applicable threshold would be for that particular project, and then the commissioning agent would then confirm that the building was built to satisfaction, giving those owner project requirements on air leakage.
And from the Earthcraft side of the equation, Earthcraft was originally and still is predominantly a suite of residential green building programs, and there are blower door test requirements, for example, built into that. It's been a few years since I've read through the Earthcraft light commercial standard, and the version I am familiar with is, superseded now, but it would surprise me if the light commercial one doesn't also include that, the testing of air leakage.
Great, thank you. Our next question in the chat, is it fair to assume that the state will be issuing an updated CPSM to clarify that VAEEC is no longer an HPBA compliance path? And I'll stop there. There's a second part as well.
Tackle the first part, and this is again where it gets confusing. The CPSM is for state facilities. So it is not at all addressing the local government requirement. So this does not take VAEEC away at all for state governments. One might even make the case, I'm not saying that it would have to be interpreted, but one might even make the case that if a local government program were to incorporate VAEEC as their green building program and can demonstrate technical equivalency to LEED or Green Globes, that they might still be able to use it and satisfy the requirements of the law if they went through all of that process. But this doesn't touch the requirements for state governments in any case.
And then the second part of that question was, do you anticipate that there'll be a grandfathering of projects that are in design?
So I understand that second part to be, if you're already doing a local government building following that VAEEC pathway, can you continue? And again, this is probably something that is best answered by Virginia Energy, but personally, I don't see why not, because these new rules went into effect July 1st, 2024. So if you were already well into design prior to that, I imagine you would stay the course. But if you're concerned about it, I think, sending that inquiry into Virginia Energy and getting something a little bit more official would probably be appropriate.
Thank you. Next, from Community Climate Collaborative, has the passage and implementation of this bill created any interest or momentum for building performance standards in Virginia?
I can start that one off. I think there is interest by some localities, but there are some challenges with the state being a Dillon's rule state and having local authority. So, there are a number of jurisdictions that are working on really great, like low carbon green buildings, high performance buildings, and they're going to show the way on how we all get there. But there's not a direct connection, I guess, that I see between this act and building performance standards directly. That's another. If you're interested in that topic, you can reach out to the VAEEC Advocacy Committee.
And then from the city of Charlottesville, as a clarifier for renovation subject to HPBA. If there's otherwise no plan to add or modify parking or vehicle infrastructure, there would still be a requirement to meet the EV charging requirements, correct?
That does seem correct. However, there is that clause about finding of special circumstances. If you find that the standards are impractical for the scope of your work, then you have the option to get a resolution by your local governing body to exempt that particular element from the High Performance Buildings Act. For that
Yeah, I
project.
guess I'll just chime in and say that would be a great question for Virginia Energy for a technical assistance to the locality.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, also the right answer.
Yeah, and it just says it doesn't say only if parking is within scope. It also doesn't say that any EV charging would have to be owned by the owner of the building. Like it could be just that there is available. So, there's different ways that could be applied in different circumstances, perhaps.
Thank you. All right, well, we do have about 6 minutes left. So if there are any additional questions, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask it directly or put it in the chat. And I also have all of our contact information up on the screen now. So feel free to get in touch with any of us afterwards if you have another question pop up. Okay. Well, hearing none, I just want to thank you all again for joining us today. We do have a blog post, as Liz had mentioned before, that gives a high level of this webinar, and then we will be sending out the audio recording later today. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any additional questions. And thank you, Liz, Bryna, and Sandra, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica, for organizing this. And thanks everybody for joining us in this discussion.
Hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks a
Right.
bunch.
Thank you.